To save his family's crumbling empire, Elijah married Charles, the notorious mad dog heir of their elite circle. On their wedding night, sporting a breathtakingly striking face straight out of a comic book, the arrogant young master violently slammed his pillow onto the hardwood floor. His eyes burned with unbridled hostility. "Elijah, don't get any ideas. I would rather die on the floor than ever touch you." Without so much as batting an eyelash, Elijah calmly signed the prenup. For over 6 months, the mad dog wreaked absolute havoc out in the world, leaving Elijah to bail him out of the precinct time and time again. The exact second his family's financial crisis was completely neutralized, Elijah pulled out the divorce papers without a shred of hesitation, ready to walk away. But Charles, who had always been so fiercely untouchable, suddenly flipped the script. That wildly untamed face was now flushed red at the corners of his eyes, looking as hopelessly pathetic as a massive hound terrified of being abandoned. Clinging desperately to the hem of Elijah's shirt, his voice trembled. "Baby, the floor is so cold. Please let me into the bed. I promise it'll be good." Under the warm yellow glow of the desk lamp deep into the night, Elijah rubbed his brow in exhaustion, his fingertips trailing over the stacks of financial reports. The quiet air was torn apart by a sudden call from the police precinct. It was Charles. Again, as the blurred orange streaks of streetlights flew past his car window, a fast-forward montage of this month's absurdities flashed through Elijah's mind. Smashed champagne towers in high-end clubs, illegal fireworks lighting up restricted airspace, and the bounty, like warrant Old Man Smith had put out on his own son, turning Charles into a walking target. Acting as the exclusive bail-out specialist bought with $1 billion investment, Elijah expertly spun the steering wheel, driving alone into the deep night of the city's north end. 3 a.m. at the traffic police detachment. The fluorescent lights in the hallway cast a harsh, cold white glare. But the second Elijah pushed open the door to the holding room, the atmospheric pressure instantly shifted. Wearing an absurdly expensive racing suit, Charles leaned lazily back in his chair, his long, powerful legs crossed. A faint streak of crimson marred his forehead, and a rebellious, bruised smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. The scuffs on his suit didn't make him look pathetic. Instead, they added a raw, dangerous feral edge. As Charles looked up, the moment their eyes locked, a fiercely aggressive, inescapable magnetism materialized in the air. It was as if all the light in the room was instantly sucked out. The air warped and trembled violently from an invisible, scorching heat, stretching the surrounding shadows into a heavy, suffocating dark orange that stalked recklessly toward Elijah at the door. Faced with this blistering wave of provocation, Elijah simply stood quiet at the edge of the shadows. He lowered his thick lashes slightly, a faint, tight line forming along his jaw. In the very next second, a smooth, pearlescent silver mist began to spread silently from his feet. Like sweet dew on a spring morning, this faint mist wrapped gently, yet with absolute irresistible force around those restless dark orange sparks, smoothing out and dissolving the explosive, scorching tension in the air bit by bit. The moment the sparks were completely snuffed out, the room's lighting returned to normal. A microscopic tremor flashed through the depths of Charles' eyes. He arched a brow in disdain, his Adam's apple bobbing with a heavy swallow. "We meet again, Mr. Elijah?" Elijah ignored the barbed greeting. His profile looked incredibly serene under the harsh lights. He turned around, his spine perfectly straight, the tip of his pen scratching sharply against the thick stack of paperwork. Once signed, he turned slightly, sweeping a passing glance over Charles before pushing the door open and stepping out into the cool, early spring night air. The pre-dawn streets were completely empty. The warm orange street lamps on either side stretched their shadows long and intimately close. Charles stood up at a glacial pace, rolling his broad shoulders as he followed him out. His gait had the lazy, lethal grace of a fully sated large predator. An ordinary black Audi sat quietly by the curb, wildly out of place compared to Charles' usual fleet of flashy supercars. Charles halted half a meter from the door. He looked down at the hand Elijah used to pull the door handle, sculpted knuckles, faint blue veins tracing beneath the skin, glowing with a cool jade like pallor in the night wind. "Thanks, mister." Elijah. A sudden smirk pulled at Charles' lips, a complex, scorching light flashing in his eyes. He added with a half-joking, half-serious grin, "If I had known you were this good, I wouldn't have fought the marriage so hard." Elijah's motion to open the door stalled for an imperceptible fraction of a second. Unbothered, he gave a faint smile and pulled the door open. The rearview mirror reflected Charles' wild, untamed face, instantly dragging Elijah's thoughts back to that fateful gamble half a year ago. Back then, the Brown family empire was teetering on the edge of collapse, debt collection notices falling like a blizzard. At the mahogany conference table where the Smith family threw down their billion-dollar chips, the room was suffocating with heavy shadow. The first time they met, Charles was in a heavy leather biker jacket, acting like a reckless wildfire. He furiously slammed the table, protesting the absolute absurdity of this arranged marriage. When Charles' eyes, burning with intense hostility and defiance, snapped over to seek an ally, Elijah, dressed in a flawless bespoke suit, met that wildfire head-on. With total calm, he delivered the answer that would alter both their fates. I do. The Charles back then had eyes filled with the shock and fury of absolute betrayal. On the day they signed the marriage papers, he had even ripped his tie loose. The corners of his eyes flushed red as he gritted his teeth, warning Elijah to know his place and stay the hell away. The flashback dissolved. Elijah lifted his gaze to the rearview mirror. Right now, the arrogant young master who had sworn he would never like him in this lifetime was sitting obediently in the passenger seat. He turned his head to look out the window. Under the warm, flowing amber streetlights filling the cabin, the sharp, lethal lines of his profile were softened into an almost unbelievable docility. Elijah's fingertips gently brushed against the steering wheel, a faint, incredibly soft smile touching his eyes, one he didn't even notice himself. The tires rolled smoothly forward, dissolving into the gentle night of the city. When they were first married, this cold, hollow house was saturated with Charles' paranoid hostility. In Elijah's memory, whether he was buttoned up perfectly in long-sleeved pajamas, typing under a cold white desk lamp, or standing on the moonlit balcony drying his hair after a shower, he always drew Charles' sharp, hyper-defensive stare. Due to long-term injections of potent suppressants, Elijah barely carried a scent. But in Charles' deeply prejudiced eyes, Elijah was constantly surrounded by dark, calculated ripples, a desperate, purposeful attempt to latch onto him. Charles would always wave away those non-existent fluctuations in the air with pure disgust, treating Elijah's instinctual offering of a helping hand or even a steaming bowl of noodles as meticulously set traps. To avoid the pointless suspicion, Elijah simply and cleanly shifted his entire life back to the company. With their paths stripped completely apart, the bristling, aggressive aura around Charles finally settled, returning to his usual, money-burning playboy baseline. It wasn't until the old man issued that ruthless ban, forcing Elijah to step in as the exclusive bail, out specialist and drag him out from under precinct lights night after night, that the icy, antagonistic edges between them were quietly sanded down by endless bail forms, giving rise to a subtle, unspoken chemistry. But Charles' intuition was actually terrifyingly accurate. This marriage was never a free lunch. Now that the Brown family's capital chain was breathing with new life, Elijah's gaze finally shifted away from his financial reports and locked flawlessly onto the prey in his passenger seat. The ultimate chips of this arranged marriage flashed in his mind: either force this wild horse to bow and wear the corporate bridle, or conceive an heir carrying the Smith family bloodline. Weighing the two, a gentle yet utterly relentless glimmer surfaced in Elijah's eyes. Charles, you need to come home today. Elijah pushed open the passenger door, the warm orange glow of the streetlight tracing his calm, serene profile. Scrolling through his phone, Charles paused. The cold blue glare of the screen lit up his raised brow. Why? Today is Mom's birthday. Elijah's voice was soft, entirely devoid of aggression, gracefully relaying Selena's non-negotiable family dinner mandate. Charles let out a cold scoff. Swinging his long legs over, he threw himself into the leather passenger seat. He turned his head away, his sharp jawline pulling tight in the shadows of the cabin. Such a dutiful daughter-in-law. Faced with the bitter, mocking jab, Elijah just offered a helpless, curved smile. The amusement in his eyes was as warm and fluid as spring water. Charles, I'm just fulfilling my duties. Landing a punch on pure cotton, Charles shrugged in deep irritation. He simply shut his eyes, burying his face entirely into the heavy shadows beyond the car window. Half an hour later, in the first-floor living room of the estate, the warm yellow floor lamp cast a tranquil, cozy glow over the plush fabric sofa. The steady rush of water from the bathroom abruptly stopped. Elijah sat quietly at the edge of the couch, a pristine white medical kit already opened on the glass coffee table in front of him. The bathroom door pushed open. Accompanied by a rolling wave of warm steam, Charles shuffled out in his slippers. A loose black silk robe was tied carelessly at his waist, leaving a wide expanse of his wet chest and sharp collarbones gleaming faintly under the light. His soaking wet, dark hair hung in a messy tangle over his forehead, and ice-cold droplets of water trailed lazily down the side of his neck. Catching sight of Elijah sitting perfectly straight on the couch, Charles' hand froze mid, towel dry. A flash of surprise crossed his eyes. "Why aren't you asleep?" Elijah tilted his head up slightly, the warm light dancing in his clear, translucent eyes. He broke into an incredibly tender smile. "I was waiting for you." The air around them seemed to freeze for a split second. A cynical, mocking smirk quickly hooked the corner of Charles' mouth. Leaning casually against the wall, his gaze darkened with an irresistible magnetism, attempting to snatch back the upper hand with cheap flirtation. "What? Waiting to sleep with me?" A ripple of utterly detached amusement swept through Elijah's mind, though his face remained a mask of perfect calm. His long fingers picked up a clean cotton swab, dabbing it into a translucent ointment. "The cut on your face needs tending to. Don't make Selena worry." The tube of high-grade ointment caught the cold glare of the light. Charles dropped the smirk, slowly sauntering over. He held out a large, demanding hand, his tone clipped. "I'll do it myself." But the exact second his fingertips were about to brush the swab, Elijah shifted. Instead of handing it over, he flipped his wrist, his cool, sculpted fingers clamping down with absolute precision over Charles' blistering hot wrist. The clash of freezing and scorching skin sent a soft, yet utterly inescapable pearlescent ripple through the air, instantly melting away the jagged, restless defiance radiating from Charles. With nothing more than a brilliantly calculated twist of his wrist, Elijah pulled. Charles' towering frame tilted helplessly against the momentum, dropping him squarely onto the plush cushions of the couch. The distance between them vanished, closing in until they were breathing each other's air. "No need to be polite?" Elijah smiled openly, a soothing, gentle light pooling in his eye. Under Charles' bewildered stare, he leaned in slightly, the medicated swab already hovering right beside the bruised corner of his mouth. He exhaled softly, his warm breath brushing against Charles' locked jaw. "Turn your head." Charles Adams' apple bobbed hard, his eyes flickering with a deeply tangled mess of emotions. Finally, trapped in Elijah's tender yet dominating gravity, he pressed his lips into a thin line. Like a massive, ferocious beast, bizarrely brought to heel, he obediently turned his cheek toward the cool touch of the medicine. The warm yellow light of the floor lamp gilded Charles' sharp browbone with a soft golden edge. That bruise on his mouth made him look like a battered, frustrated pup, radiating an incredibly rare vulnerability. Elijah's fingertips twitched. A dark, hidden urge flashed through his eyes, the sudden, intense craving to press down hard, just to watch those wild, untamed eyes flush with a wet, desperate heat. But he merely took a deep breath, burying that dark thrill beneath his tranquil gaze. Elijah's long fingers tossed the used swab into the trash bin beside them. Taking the translucent ointment directly onto his bare fingertip, he pressed it flush against the scorching skin. It might be a little cold. As the pad of his finger gently kneaded the skin, Charles' entire body locked up, his breath skipping a beat. With the friction of skin against skin, the surrounding air suddenly turned thick and heavy. Clusters of restless, dark red light visibly bled from the side of Charles' neck, darting wildly through the air like tiny, silent sparks of fire. The tips of his ears and his throat were rapidly painted a flushed, burning red by this invisible, intoxicating heat. "Does it hurt?" Elijah's pale eyes remained totally placid, as if he were completely blind to the wild, dark red sparks gnashing their teeth in the air around them. Charles swallowed violently. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, Elijah leaned in without a single warning. His warm breath brushed right over the corner of Charles' lips as he blew on the wound, impossibly gentle. That single breath was like a spring breeze, instantly shattering the restless dark flames dancing in the air. Charles' eyes shot wide open, his long lashes trembling violently like the wings of a startled butterfly. By the time his reflexes kicked in and he raised a hand to push him away, Elijah had already smoothly straightened up, restoring a safe, calculated distance between them. All done. Elijah tossed a wet wipe perfectly into the basket, his voice as cool and crisp as ever. He left Charles sitting absolutely paralyzed against the sofa, his hands suspended in mid-air, fingers curling slightly inwards. A chaotic mix of shock and total helplessness tangled in the depths of the alpha's eyes. Get some sleep. We have a show to put on tomorrow. Packing up the medical kit, Elijah turned and ascended the wooden staircase. In his peripheral vision, he caught the untouchable, arrogant young master awkwardly rubbing the back of his hand against the cheek that had just been touched. A waterfall of shattered, cold white light from the crystal chandeliers poured over Selena's birthday banquet, through the refracted glints of the champagne tower and the glamorous blur of mingling guests. Elijah's gaze locked onto Gavin, dressed in a charcoal bespoke suit, the rimless glasses catching the cold, rational glare of the room. Charles' twin brother stood like a flawlessly pruned winter pine. Even the way the light flowed around him radiated absolute restraint and tranquility, a stark night and day contrast to the scorching, wildfire, like domination that Charles possessed. How about it? A dangerously soft, mocking laugh suddenly detonated right next to his ear. Charles had closed in without making a sound. Pushing his sunglasses carelessly to the top of his head, a sharp, biting mockery bled from his narrowed eyes. Mesmerized by my brother, aren't you? Think that's what perfection looks like. Dropping his voice to a low gravel, his warm breath swept over Elijah's ear in blatant provocation. The marriage is a sham anyway. Want me to set you two up? His gaze was nailed dead onto Elijah's face, glaring like a viciously territorial, fiercely stubborn panther protecting its kill. Elijah turned his head at a glacial pace, the reflection of Charles' tightly strung jawline perfectly mirrored in his eyes. He shook his head gently. No. Charles arched a single brow. I still think. Elijah paused deliberately. He watched Charles' breath hitch for a fraction of a second, before letting the rest of the sentence slip out in an incredibly light, agonizingly slow drawl. You're better. Real. Bold. Incredibly cute. Those few words acted like a lethal neutralizing agent, instantly melting away the defensive thorns bristling all over Charles. His pupils dilated violently, trembling, as a breathtakingly vivid flush crawled rapidly from the base of his ears straight to his cheeks. Raising a stiff arm, he violently yanked the sunglasses back down to hide his eyes. Rubbing the tip of his nose in a painfully obvious attempt to cover his tracks, the cold scoff he let out couldn't hide the stutter underneath. At least you have good taste. The brief standoff was cut short by Gavin's steady approach. Pleasantries, greetings, and precise critiques on the project. Gavin's few polite words were quickly swallowed by the noisy background chatter. The second he smiled gracefully and walked away, a rustling undertow of whispers instantly surged from the corner. Several greasy, flapping lips were magnified in the dim light. The eldest young master hit the investment targets 3 months early. Has been exceptional since day one. Unlike his twin brother, can't do a damn thing right. Wearing his sunglasses, Charles pressed his thin lips into a dead, silent line. The air around him seemed to solidify into heavy blocks of lead. He was used to it. But Elijah wasn't. Elijah lowered his lashes, masking the cold razor, sharp glint flashing in the depths of his eyes. He tilted his head slightly, his long index finger giving a subtle beckon to a passing waiter. After a few whispered words, the waiter disappeared into the crowd with his tray. Less than 10 minutes later, the scene violently shifted. A spiked shot of hard liquor. A white towel. The middle-aged man, who was just running his mouth a second ago, was now deathly pale. Clutching his cramping stomach, he scurried wildly toward the restroom like a comical crab. The other man's face was completely flushed, the veins on his neck bulging. He writhed frantically beneath the expensive fabric of his bespoke suit, acting as if millions of invisible ants were tearing at him just under his skin. The crystal rim of the glass refracted the incredibly faint, yet utterly ruthless smirk playing on Elijah's lips. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his golden champagne. Suddenly, a scorching, heavy gaze locked onto his profile. Elijah turned his head. Over the lowered rim of his sunglasses, Charles was staring a hole through him. His eyes churned with shock and an unspeakable wild fervor, having clearly witnessed every detail of that secret execution. His cover partially blown, Elijah didn't panic. He tilted his head, meeting that blistering stare, head on, and gave a quick, light-hearted wink. The chandelier's shattered light danced in that playfully closed eye for a split second, like a thorny white rose blooming in the dead of night. After the banquet, Selena's absolute non-negotiable orders shoved them straight into a guest room in the old estate, one bathed in an ambiguous red glow. A massive king bed, festive bedding, and obscenely obvious protection sitting right on the nightstand. Charles aggressively yanked his tie loose, his jaw muscles jumping. "You take the bed, I'll sleep on the floor." With zero extra words, he spun around and strode into the bathroom. The heavy rush of water soon echoed from behind the frosted glass door. Elijah sat alone at the edge of the bed, the warm light hitting his sculpted knuckles. As the minutes ticked by, the water abruptly shut off, leaving a dead silence behind the door. A dark, creeping unease gathered in the slight furrow of Elijah's brow. He walked up to the door and tapped his knuckles against the glass. "Charles?" Thud, a heavy, muffled crash against the tiles. Elijah violently twisted the doorknob. The second the door pushed open, the bathroom's cold, harsh fluorescent light was completely warped by an invisible gravity. The air felt like it was baking under intense heat, vibrating violently in a suffocating dark orange phenomena. Visible, dangerously glowing red embers floated in the air like a wildfire spiraling out of control, frantically devouring the oxygen around them. Charles slumped helplessly against the slick tiles. His skin burned with a sickening, flushed crimson. His chest heaved, and cold sweat rolled down his bulging veins. It was a rut. That piece of cake Selena handed him was spiked. "I'll get a doctor." Elijah's pupils shrank just as he turned around. A body as scorching as molten lava slammed heavily into his back, dragging a devastating dark orange storm with it. The world spun, and Elijah was pinned hard against the freezing tile floor. Those dark orange embers instantly crystallized into a tangible heat wave, wrapping around Elijah with absolute domination. The skin on the back of Elijah's neck, right beneath his suppressant patch, instantly flushed with a feverish red, the veins beneath pulsing wildly. A trembling electric numbness detonated from the base of his spine. His fingertips curled and shook, entirely out of his control. "Charles," Elijah bit down hard on his lower lip until it turned bloodless and pale. "Hold on. Your suppressants?" The rest of his words were completely crushed by a rough, searing kiss. Charles' kiss held absolutely no reason. It was an overwhelming primal hunger. Elijah let out a muffled groan. He pressed his hands hard against Charles' iron, solid chest, his knuckles turning white from the strain, but he couldn't budge the man an inch. Charles' blistering hands dragged inch by inch up Elijah's waistline, finally locking flawlessly onto the back of his neck. His rough thumb, separated only by the medical tape, pressed fiercely and obsessively against the Omega's most vulnerable gland. A violent electric shock tore through Elijah's entire body. Swallowed in that raging dark orange storm, Elijah's defenses crumbled. His long eyelashes fluttered shut, his pale neck arching back in a fragile curve, and he parted his lips to seamlessly receive the kiss. Feeling the surrender beneath him, Charles' torrential, stormy movements stalled for half a second. In that exact lightning, fast split second, Elijah's hand, which had been resting loosely at Charles' waist, slid sharply downward, pulling out an ice, cold black metal cylinder. BZZD, a blinding cold blue arc of electricity instantly lit up the entire bathroom. The next morning, golden sunlight sliced through the gaps in the curtains, casting sharp, geometric patches of light across the floor. Charles pried his eyes open amidst the total wreck of the room. Rubbing his throbbing hangover, heavy temples, the absurd, frenzied flashes of last night pieced themselves together in his head like shattered glass. His head snapped up. On the armchair just steps away, Elijah was bathed in the gentle morning light. Holding a steaming mug of water, he gazed back at him with absolute tranquility. Charles Adams' apple bobbed violently. His raspy voice carried a jaw-clenching disbelief. "Elijah, did you tase me?" Elijah stood up, walking over against the light, and handed him the warm water. His voice was as soothing as if he were coaxing a bristling cat. "You completely lost your mind. I just didn't want you to cross a line with me when you had absolutely zero free will." But this completely rational breakdown couldn't pierce Charles' sky, high defense mechanisms. He glared at Elijah, his eyes a tangled mess of shock, fury, and a sliver of unrecognized humiliation and sting from being rejected. "So, you tased me?" Charles raised his voice, his chest heaving. Looking at the stubborn, spiraling young master in front of him, Elijah sighed helplessly in his heart, though a faint, indulgent glimmer rippled in his eyes. He effortlessly softened his tone. "I'm sorry. Tasing you was my fault. How about I let you tase me back?" That was basically throwing gasoline on a fire. Charles shot him a vicious glare, spun around, and violently yanked the blanket over himself. Wrapped tight from head to toe with his back to Elijah, he fumed like a cocoon about to explode. The morning light traced that ridiculous, adorable silhouette with a soft, fuzzy glow. Elijah laughed soundlessly. He crouched down slowly, leveling his gaze with the blanket lump. His voice held the tender patience of coaxing a child. "Considering I gave you the only blanket last night, can you not be mad at me?" A muffled, cold scoff came from under the covers. Poking his messy head out halfway, Charles turned his gaze away with pure, stubborn pride. "Who gives a damn about this blanket?" "I do. I give a lot of damns about it," Elijah said, his eyes curving with a breezy smile. "You have no idea. Curled up on the bed last night, I was so incredibly jealous that you had a blanket." Charles' mouth twitched involuntarily. He snapped back stiffly, "Then bring it to the bed and we'll share it. It's not like I'm stingy." "You said you were going to sleep on the floor?" Elijah dragged out the syllables deliberately, a sly glint dancing in his eyes. "I wouldn't dare disobey you." "Wouldn't dare disobey me? But you dared to tase me?" Charles' voice bled with 1,000% grievance. Beneath that mask of fury hid a deeply bruised ego with nowhere to land after being pushed away. Elijah dropped the teasing from his eyes. Reaching out with cool fingertips, he gently poked Charles' tight cheek. He locked onto Charles' dodging eyes. Word by word, his voice was soft but carried absolute weight. "Charles, it's not that I don't like you." Charles' body froze instantly. "I tased you because your marriage has already been manipulated once. I refuse to let your body be manipulated a second time." Elijah's gaze was like a warm spring, enveloping every single defensive thorn on Charles' body. "If you truly want this, we can, anytime." Right before his eyes, a violent crimson exploded from the base of Charles' ears, spreading like wildfire all the way down his neck. He flinched backward, wildly yanking that poor blanket back over his head. A few seconds later, a stuttering, muffled roar echoed from beneath the heavy fabric. "Elijah, you have absolutely zero shame." Who said I even wanted it?" Elijah gave a faint smile, dressed himself flawlessly, and stepped out the door. The moment he walked down the stairs, he bumped into Selena. The shrewd matriarch seemed to be taking a casual morning stroll, but the second her gaze landed on Elijah, an incredibly sharp, probing glint flashed in her eyes. "Elijah, you're up?" Selena stepped forward with a warm smile, her eyes scanning his immaculate collar and composed gait like a radar. "How did you sleep last night? Are you getting used to it?" "I slept wonderfully, Mom." "Thank you for asking," Elijah replied, a flawless, gentle smile curving his lips. Selena seamlessly withdrew her gaze. Despite her best efforts to mask it, the clear disappointment of failing to spot any battle damage was plainly visible in her eyes. She let out a soft sigh. "Well, as long as you slept well." Barely had she finished speaking when a faint rustle came from the hallway behind them. Rubbing his lower back, Charles shuffled out of that romantically lit guest room. The young master, who usually walked with an arrogant swagger, now moved with a bizarre, stiff sluggishness. His brows were knit in pain, looking exactly as if every ounce of his energy had been violently drained out of him overnight. Selena's gaze locked onto the hand rubbing his waist like a heat-seeking missile, then rapidly swept over his grimacing face. Within a single second, the disappointment in her eyes was replaced by a massive, unspoken, overwhelming ecstasy. The thrill was so intense that the smile on her face began to curl upward, completely out of her control. "Oh, Charles is up too?" Selena's voice practically carried a joyous tremor. Sharply sensing the bizarre shift in the room's atmosphere, Charles slammed on the brakes. He snatched his hand away from his back, like he'd been electrocuted. "Mom, it's not what you think." He started frantically, a thin layer of embarrassed red rushing to his cheeks. "Don't worry. Selena cut him off with a beaming smile, her eyes sparkling with an incredibly knowing, maternal glow. Mom isn't thinking a thing. His jaw practically hitting the floor, Charles tried to mount a final, desperate defense. But Selena had already turned around, practically skipping her way toward the dining room in total satisfaction. "Wash your face and head to the dining room. Breakfast is ready." She suddenly stopped and turned to the butler beside her, her voice ringing crystal clear in the quiet hallway. "Oh, right. Have the kitchen prepare some extra nourishing dishes for lunch. Make sure the beef bone broth is extra rich. Young people burn through a lot of energy. They need to eat more to keep their stamina up." The air in the hallway solidified. Charles' face instantly went black as thunder, while that humiliating dark red flush burned all the way from his neck straight to the tips of his ears. He snapped his head around, glaring murderously at Elijah. His clenched jaw glare screamed a single accusation: "Elijah, look what you've done." Faced with this practically tangible fury, Elijah merely arched a brow with effortless grace. Acting as if he hadn't understood a single word of Selena's explicit innuendo, and entirely blind to the raging fire in Charles' eyes, he calmly walked right past him toward the dining room. "Elijah, this is all your fault. Just you wait." Charles dropped his voice into a low, vicious growl behind his back, pacing like a highly agitated, trapped beast. In truth, Elijah did feel a fleeting, microscopic pang of regret over that lie. He didn't tase Charles for Charles' sake. As an Omega completely obsessed with pure logic and absolute control, Elijah despised any variable that could lead to a loss of control, whether it was alcohol, intense emotions, or the primal raw hunger hijacked by pheromone. He had never intended to actually sleep with Charles. In his carefully plotted script, the optimal solution for this marriage mandate was always a precise, perfectly controlled IVF procedure using Charles genetics. But now, thanks to one taser shock and a single lie, the script had completely derailed. Desperate to prove just how capable he was and to claw back his shattered pride, the arrogant young master couldn't bring himself to clear the air. Instead, he launched into a painfully clumsy, try-hard game of seduction. Night fell. Only a few wall sconces lit the expansive living room. Elijah sat in the armchair, entirely focused on the financial indices jumping across the TV screen. The bathroom door opened. Charles walked out wearing a sheer dark green silk robe. The belt hung dangerously loose. With every movement, massive expanses of his chest and deeply sculpted abs flashed in the half-light. He seemed to casually towel, dry his dripping hair, but everything, from the exact spot he paused, to the precise angle he raised his arm to flex his muscles, was meticulously, aggressively calculated. Elijah merely gave him a polite, passing glance before returning his gaze squarely to the NASDAQ. Completely ignored, Charles ground his back teeth, a flash of pure indignation crossing his eyes. What followed was a high-frequency, utterly ineffective parade right in front of the TV, like a peacock desperately fanning its tail while patrolling its territory. Walking to the coffee table to pour water, flipping through magazines at the bookshelf, standing by the floor to ceiling windows, pretending to admire the moon. When he made his third attempt to wipe non-existent dust off the TV console with a tissue, all just to aggressively show off the undeniably sexy, rippling muscles of his back, Elijah finally spoke. "Charles." Charles' eyes instantly lit up like twin searchlights. He froze his actions immediately, playing hard to get as he swept his wet hair back from his forehead. Turning around, he asked in a low, raspy, deliberately gravelly voice, "Yeah, what is it?" Elijah looked at him, his expression completely serious and deeply earnest. "If you ate too much at dinner and need to digest, going outside for a walk would be much more effective." Charles' expression shattered. A single drop of water fell from the tip of his hair, tracing a slow line down his sculpted abs before disappearing into the dangerously low, suggestive waistband of his pants. Undeniably, the visual was an absolute knockout. But Elijah simply waved him off with ruthless efficiency, like swatting away a bug blocking his view. His tone was strict, "Step aside. You're blocking the screen." In that exact moment, Charles felt his fiercely guarded alpha magnetism get pulverized into dust by those few weightless words. Looking utterly defeated, his eyes flushed red as he glared at Elijah. "I'm literally doing all this, and you have absolutely nothing else to say?" Elijah tilted his head, looking as if he were genuinely giving it some serious thought. A moment later, he nodded with absolute solemnity. It's getting cold. Put some clothes on so you don't catch a cold. Elijah, I hate you. With a low, completely broken roar, Charles yanked his robe tight. Like a rooster utterly humiliated in a cockfight, he stormed furiously back into his bedroom. But Charles didn't give up. As the days ticked by, the fabric of his robes grew sparser, and he mastered a much more covert form of testing the waters. The air was no longer suffocated by the overwhelming avalanche-like domination of hard liquor. Instead, it dissolved into a razor-thin, incredibly faint trace of gunpowder. Like a soft feather, it would silently glide over the gland at the back of Elijah's neck when he wasn't paying attention, sparking a microscopic shiver before swiftly and cunningly retreating. Elijah found it utterly fascinating. He watched this proud, ferocious beast rack his brain every single day to set traps, waiting with eyes full of anticipation for him to jump in, only to have Elijah effortlessly dismantle and even reverse the trap with just a few casual words. He watched Charles' bright eyes bounce wildly between hope and defeat until the alpha could only storm off in a huff. This cat and mouse game gradually became Elijah's most treasured, secret way to unwind after work. But today, when Elijah pushed the front door open, he was greeted only by a house full of dead silence. There were no deliberate, pacing footsteps. There was no ghost of that teasing scent. Standing in the foyer, an inexplicable, microscopic wave of disappointment swelled in Elijah's chest. After clearing his inbox, he sat in his usual spot with a cup of herbal tea. The financial news continued to drone on the screen, but he ended up zoning out, staring blankly at the flickering ticker for a long time. Without that figure constantly pacing back and forth in front of the TV, the entire living room felt incredibly hollow and dull. Elijah let out a soft sigh and shook his head. Just as he was about to get up and head to his room, the frantic rattling of the front door lock suddenly echoed through the house. The keypad beeped twice with an error tone. A long moment later, accompanied by the heavy sound of the door pushing open, a thick wave of alcohol mixed with the night wind flooded the living room. Charles was wearing his slippers on the wrong feet. Like a sailboat that had lost its rudder, he stumbled and drifted toward the center of the room. His head hung low, his tie was askew, and those normally untamed arrogant eyes were now damp, as if covered by a heavy layer of mist. Elijah quietly set down his teacup, the porcelain clicking faintly against the glass coffee table. Charles stopped just a step away from him. He pressed his lips into a tight line, his glassy, wet gaze nailed to Elijah's face. In the very next second, as if all the strength had been completely drained from his body, he tipped forward. His arms locked around Elijah's waist in a death grip, and he buried his heavy head straight into the crook of Elijah's neck. Elijah? His slurred voice was thick with congestion and booze, whimpering exactly like a massive hound that had suffered some earth-shattering grievance. Elijah didn't push him away. He simply leaned back into the sofa to absorb the weight. I hate you. Charles buried his face even deeper into that warmth. His muffled voice vibrated through the fabric, yet the arms banded around Elijah's waist tightened even further, as if he were trying to crush himself and merge right into Elijah's bones. Elijah was amused by the sheer contradiction of it all. He raised a hand, his fingertips gently playing with a stubborn cowlick at the back of Charles' head. Hating me again, are we? Yeah. Charles nodded aggressively, his messy hair brushing against Elijah's jaw and kicking up a swarm of tiny, ticklish sparks. I fucking hate you. Elijah reached down, pinching his warm cheek with just enough force. And why is that? A brief silence followed. Charles seemed to be genuinely searching through his heavily intoxicated brain for the right words, before suddenly launching into a deeply aggrieved accusation. I just do. You know exactly what I'm thinking, but you string me along on purpose. You're so fucking mean. This accusation, so raw and stripped of any pretense, made a soft laugh slip past Elijah's lips. The vibration in his chest only pissed the drunk alpha off. Thinking he was being mocked, Charles struggled in protest and snapped his head up, his hazy, intoxicated eyes overflowing with accusation. When their gazes collided, the naked, unmasked hunger in Charles' eyes made Elijah feel a rare flicker of nerve. A thin layer of red rapidly dusted his pale ears, and he instinctively looked away. Seeing Elijah dodge him, Charles let out an indignant huff. As if executing some clumsy primal punishment, he suddenly dipped his head and bit down hard on the side of Elijah's neck. This sudden ambush completely shattered Elijah's physical equilibrium. Suppressed for years by medication, his native omega pheromones, a cool, profound scent of rain, washed moss, instantly exploded into the air. Charles Adams' apple bobbed violently. He released his bite. Like a puppy following a trail, he pressed his nose directly against the back of Elijah's neck, inhaling greedily. He looked up, his bright eyes shimmering with raw need. Smells so good. Give me a little more. Elijah tilted his head slightly, pressing one hand against that messy mop of hair, attempting to reclaim the upper hand with a low, steady voice. Who was it that said my pheromones smelled awful before? Wasn't me. It was a dog, Charles replied, without a single second of hesitation. It was you stupid puppy. Not awful? I like it. Charles shook his head, nuzzling his nose right into Elijah's palm with a satisfied, entirely intoxicated murmur. I absolutely love it. The wall clock in the living room ticked quietly. Surrounded by that cool scent of moss, Elijah heard a frantic, deafening, completely out of control, heartbeat thumping wildly inside his own chest. Inside the first-class cabin to Country Y, Elijah and Charles sat side by side. What was supposed to be a dry, tedious business trip had evolved into a joint excursion, courtesy of Selena's unilateral decree to treat it as a honeymoon while you're at it. Though Charles barely spoke a word the entire flight, those eyes constantly drifting toward Elijah, gleaming with poorly concealed anticipation, completely sold him out. Gavin picked them up at the airport. As the unshakable anchor of the Smith family's operations in Country Y, he drove them straight to a tranquil, secluded lakeside villa under his own name. The exact second they pushed open the guest room door, Charles' gaze turned blistering hot. Beyond the panoramic floor to ceiling windows lay a shimmering, sunlit lake. A hazy romantic steam drifted from the semi-open bathroom, and the massive king-size bed was completely blanketed in obscenely suggestive red rose petals. But Elijah clearly had zero intention of surrendering to this romantic trap. With clean, ruthless efficiency, he tugged his tie loose, severing every single one of Charles' wild fantasies. Same rules apply. You take the floor. The blazing heat in Charles' eyes was instantly snuffed out. Frustrated, he kicked the ridiculously expensive Persian rug beneath his feet, grumbling under his breath. Elijah, literally an heir to the Smith family. What kind of young master sleeps on the floor every night? It's humiliating if word gets out. Elijah looked at his deeply aggrieved expression and simply went with the flow, nodding. You're right. Sleeping on the floor is a real injustice to you. From now on, you take the bed and sleep on the floor. Elijah, seriously going to start hating you. Glaring at him in utter exasperation, Charles viciously grabbed his pillow, slammed it onto the plush carpet, and rolled over, facing away from him, curling up into a furiously anti-social cocoon. Standing exactly where he was, Elijah quietly watched his back. A bizarre, entirely unexpected twinge of pity rippled through his chest. Over the next few days, business consumed every ounce of Elijah's energy. Inside the smoke-filled, highly charged conference rooms, he and Gavin displayed a terrifying level of synergy. Gavin hammered down the grand strategy with ruthless tactics, while Elijah used pinpoint data and flawless market analysis to systematically shatter their opponents' bottom lines time and time again. Elijah, your professional acumen is even sharper than I imagined. After the meetings wrapped, Gavin handed him a rich cup of black coffee, the gaze behind his gold-rimmed glasses brimming with naked admiration. Mother was absolutely right. Working with you is incredibly effortless. You flatter me, Gavin. It's a team effort. Elijah accepted the coffee with a polite, impossibly humble smile. The moment the business negotiations concluded, a crazy Charles instantly unleashed a staggering amount of energy. Refusing to take no for an answer, he dragged them both straight to a ski resort at the foothills of the Alps. On the snow-blind black diamond runs, Charles was like a snow leopard returning to its natural habitat. He carved down the steep slopes with lightning speed, executing extreme, mid-air flips with liquid grace. In that moment, stripped of his playboy facade and framed by the brilliant sun and blinding white snow, Charles exploded with a feral, breathtaking vitality that made it utterly impossible to look away. Down at the edge of the bunny slopes, Elijah stared at his own clumsy, bored, stiff movements on his skis and let out a quiet sigh. Swoosh! Kicking up a massive spray of powder, Charles executed a wildly arrogant hard stop, planting himself perfectly in front of Elijah. He shoved his snow goggles up, revealing a nose flushed red from the cold and a pair of fiercely radiant eyes. Hey, Elijah. So, did I look cool out there? Yeah. Very cool. Elijah offered his genuine appraisal. Petting the young master's ego instantly made him cocky. He aggressively insisted on giving Elijah a masterclass. To be fair, Charles was surprisingly patient in the moment, meticulously breaking down every single detail of weight distribution. But his mouth remained as obnoxiously punchable as ever. You're way too stiff. The 80-year-old grandpa next to us is skiing better than you. Supremely vindictive, Elijah launched an immediate counterattack. Feigning a loss of balance, he grabbed Charles' sleeve with lethal precision. With a startled yelp, the two of them tumbled together right into a soft, deep snowbank. Freezing powder sprayed all over their faces. Refusing to be outdone, Charles grabbed a handful of snow and shoved it straight down Elijah's collar, while Elijah ruthlessly pinched Charles' cheeks in retaliation. Under Gavin's distant watch, the two of them rolled around in the snow without a single shred of dignity, throwing insults about who was being more childish as their laughter echoed across the vast empty slopes. Amidst the falling snow, Elijah brushed the powder from his collar. His normally calm, fiercely restrained face was flushed with a rare, radiant vibrancy. However, an inescapable, dominating gaze crashed down on him from above like an ice-cold searchlight. Elijah raised his head. Under the pine trees a short distance away, Gavin stood completely still. His rimless glasses refracted the pale, blinding glare of the snow, making his tall, perfectly straight silhouette look all the more solitary and untouchable. Night fell. Inside the lakeside villa's study, only a single warm yellow desk lamp remained lit. Gavin pushed a craft paper envelope in front of Elijah. Following his movement, a layer of cold, meticulously structured dark green frost quietly spread through the air. Carrying a suffocating sense of absolute domination, it crept inch by inch across the mahogany desk. Elijah, you're a smart man. Gavin's voice was gentle, yet undeniable. The two documents inside the envelope stung the eyes. One was a divorce agreement between Elijah and Charles, and the other was a marriage application with Gavin. Looking at the flawless patriarch before him, Elijah's pale pupils constricted slightly. If it had been half a year ago, faced with a transaction that would maximize the family's interests, he would have signed without a second of hesitation. A suffocating montage rapidly flashed through his mind. The greedy faces of relatives at a funeral when he was 16, countless early mornings agonizing over the inheritance until his stomach bled, and the frantically flashing red light outside the ICU doors. During those darkest years, he operated like a precision machine, crushing every ounce of weakness with the most potent suppressants. Marriage was nothing more than a cold chip on the scale. But now, Elijah lowered his thick lashes and pushed the documents right back. The dark green frost ground to a dead halt right before his fingertips. His thoughts were inescapably pulled back to a few days ago, to the sudden collapse caused by an overdose of suppressants. The cold, white fluorescent lights in the hospital room flickered dismally. When Elijah struggled to pry his eyes open from the coma, the initially temperature, less visual space was completely wrapped in an incredibly warm halo, like flowing golden amber. The light trembled softly in the air, gently devouring all the terrifying cold gray glare in the room. The dead center of his focus was Charles. The young master, usually so arrogant and untamed, looked utterly wrecked right now. His jaw was locked tight. His normally clear eyes were covered in terrifying red veins, the corners damp with a heartbreaking, desperate flush. Elijah, how do you feel? Does it hurt? Seeing Elijah open his eyes, Charles threw himself at the bedside. Those hands, always so long and powerful, were actually trembling right now. How long had it been since anyone asked him if he hurt? Through a decade of sinking and swimming in the cutthroat business world, everyone was strictly calculating his exploitation value. Only this idiot right in front of him had eyes brimming with pure, naked agony and care. It was as if the tip of his heart had been severely scorched by the warm spring sun, melting into a pool of spring water. watching Charles frantically wipe away the dampness at the corners of his eyes with his sleeve, rambling on as he picked up the hot porridge from the thermos. Elijah's usually cold, detached eyes, completely blurred with tears. "Charles, come closer." Elijah's voice was hoarse, yet it carried a softness that had stripped away every last defense. "What is it?" Charles held the bowl in a daze, leaning down with absolute obedience. "Come closer. Let me kiss you." Reflected in Charles' wildly dilated pupils, Elijah tilted his pale yet breathtaking face upward. He reached out with cool fingertips, gently cupping that chiseled cheek, and took the initiative to press his lips against those trembling ones. The exact second their lips met, the cool, profound scent that had been suppressed inside Elijah for years finally broke ground. It transformed into countless streaks of soft, silver-green shimmer, gently intertwining and tangling with the blistering amber halo wrapped around Charles. In that moment, the entire cold, harsh world dissolved into nothing but ultimate warmth and healing. Back in the study, dust motes hung silently in the warm yellow glow of the desk lamp. Elijah's long, unwavering fingers pushed the heavy craft envelope right back in front of Gavin. Strangely, Gavin's flawlessly sculpted face showed no shock of rejection, only a microscopic trace of expected regret. He tapped his long fingers lightly against the desk, the gaze behind his gold-rimmed glasses fathomless. "I knew this would be the outcome back on the ski slopes." Elijah furrowed his brow slightly, a sliver of clear confusion flashing through his eyes. If the ending was already set in stone, why go through all this trouble? Parting his thin lips, Gavin laid out his meticulous observations. "Elijah, you probably haven't even noticed it yourself, but only when you're around Charles do you show the nature someone your age should have. You get angry, you get exasperated, you get amused, and you secretly go soft. You're no longer that flawless, airtight mister. Elijah driven by cold programming in the boardroom. You're just Elijah." With that said, Gavin casually tossed the two agreements, documents capable of triggering a massive earthquake in their elite circles, right into the wastebasket beside him. Then, he pulled a thick, dark blue file from his briefcase and pushed it gently across the desk. "Dad asked me to pass this to you." Gavin's voice returned to its standard, measured calm. "I apologize. That earlier envelope was a test. He wanted to know if, faced with an option to maximize profits, you would treat Charles as a disposable pawn. It seems you've passed." Elijah looked down at the file, embossed with the family's watermark, a cold, mocking smirk hooking the corner of his mouth. "So, is this my reward for clearing the level?" Gavin didn't deny it. He tipped his chin up slightly. "Read it. You'll understand his caution." The moment he flipped open the cover, the bold black letters on white paper hit his eyes. "Share transfer agreement. Dad wants to retire early and travel the world with Mom. The Smith family's assets will be split evenly. Charles has zero interest in it, so his half will be taken over entirely by you." Pushing open the heavy wooden doors of the study, the moonlight outside in the hallway was as fluid as water. In the shadows of the staircase corner not far away, a sneaky sliver of a hem was trying to vanish into the dark. The second the person got a clear look at Elijah, they recoiled like they'd been burned, pulling a long face and turning to leave immediately. "Charles." Elijah's voice sounded exceptionally gentle in the quiet corridor, but the retreating figure acted completely deaf. Instead, his long legs picked up the pace, practically breaking into a desperate sprint to escape. Exasperated, Elijah quickened his pace and followed. "What's wrong now, my young master?" Charles slammed on the brakes and whipped around, shooting him a vicious glare. By the weak light of the wall sconces, Elijah finally noticed that the hot-tempered young master's eyes were flushed as red as a startled rabbit, brimming with unshed tears. Before Elijah could even open his mouth to coax him, Charles actually threw a fit and bolted. "Charles, take one more step, and I'll ignore you forever." The sentence acted like a binding spell. Charles' footsteps were instantly nailed to the ground. Yet, he stubbornly refused to turn around. Only the ring of white fur on his puffer jacket's hood trembled pitifully in the night wind. Elijah walked around to face him. As if facing off against a terrifying enemy, Charles slapped his hands over his ears in a death grip, squeezing his eyes shut and yelling, "I'm not listening." Looking at him throwing a tantrum like a child, Elijah's heart felt as if it had been stuffed with soft cotton. His tone was full of indulgence and helpless affection. Not even if I'm confessing to you? Charles kept his ears tightly covered, his voice carrying a heartbreaking mix of despair and absolute stubbornness. Elijah, I don't care what you say. I will never agree to a divorce. I'd rather die than agree. So it was those agreements in the wastebasket causing all the trouble. Elijah let out a soft sigh, forcefully pulling those large, sculpted hands away. Charles, you misunderstood me. But Charles, completely spiraling in sheer panic, couldn't process a single word of explanation. Drowning in the betrayal playing out in his own head, he gritted his teeth and started ranting. I knew it. I knew Gavin was up to no good. He loved stealing my things when we were kids, and now that we're grown, he's trying to seduce my wife. That bastard, I'm going to kill. The rest of his words were completely sealed by an incredibly tender kiss, carrying the fresh scent of rain-washed moss. Half a long minute later, Charles' previously pale face instantly turned as red as a ripe tomato. He was entirely subdued. After hearing Elijah lay out exactly what had happened, Charles was so embarrassed, his eyes darted everywhere, desperately wishing he could drill a hole right through the hallway floor and hide inside. So, Charles cleared his throat awkwardly. What I just said about my brother. Can you pretend you didn't hear that? Looking at his overly cautious expression, Elijah couldn't hold it back anymore. The corners of his eyes curved into beautiful crescent moons, his clear gaze shimmering like water. Let me kiss you again, and I'll agree. Charles would never know. At the very end of their conversation that day, when Elijah had closed that dark blue share transfer agreement, Gavin had pushed up the gold-rimmed glasses on his nose. A terrifyingly dangerous, obsessive dark light had flashed behind the lenses. Elijah, everything I just said. While it was Dad's test, it was also my genuine intention. Gavin's voice dropped incredibly low, carrying the inescapable allure of someone playing to win. If you ever get bored of Charles, you could always consider me. Charles would never, ever know about this wildly aggressive interlude, because in Elijah's world that day would never, ever come.
After finishing this story, all I can say is, only pure sincerity can win a genuine heart. Elijah is an Omega who built his entire existence on precise calculation and absolute control. The devastating loss of his parents at 16, forcing him to face greedy relatives fighting over the estate, turned him into a corporate machine running solely for the survival of his family's empire. He was used to crushing his biological instincts with potent suppressants, viewing marriage through the cold, calculated lens of a transaction. Faced with his husband Charles' initial paranoia and provocations, Elijah maintained an incredibly steady emotional baseline, calmly playing the role of the flawless clean-up specialist. But beneath that icy, untouchable exterior hides an iron will and a fierce protectiveness. When outsiders dared to mock Charles, Elijah didn't hesitate to strike back with ruthless shadow-like precision. The moment that truly defines his core was when Charles was spiked and dragged into his rut. Elijah's cold rationality completely overpowered an Omega's primal instinct to submit. He absolutely refused to lose control, and he would never allow his body to be manipulated. Charles, on the other hand, grew up in a wealthy, deeply loving environment. He is an alpha as blazing and untamed as a wildfire, incredibly arrogant and stubborn on the surface, yet carrying a heart of absolute purity. At first, Charles was like a bristling hedgehog, using absurd playboy antics to fight back against the arranged marriage, keeping his walls sky high. Yet, under Elijah's silent, endless indulgence, this mad dog was gradually brought to heel. Once he realized he was hooked, Charles' towering ego wouldn't let him simply swallow his pride and confess. Instead, he resorted to a clumsy, desperately deliberate game of seduction, parading around the living room in nothing but a sheer robe and testing the waters with teasing, microscopic traces of his pheromones. Beneath his dominating facade lies a boy who blushes at the drop of a hat, harboring a soft, almost childlike vulnerability. When Elijah collapsed from exhaustion and ended up in the hospital, Charles completely shattered his own mask. With red-rimmed eyes, he awkwardly scrambled to take care of him, pouring out his naked, unreserved devotion and heartache. and it was exactly this raw, unfiltered purity that became the ultimate key to Elijah's heart. Having navigated a world suffocated by cold calculations and treachery, charless, reckless, all-consuming sincerity was the most precious thing he could ever ask for. Congratulations to Elijah for claiming his pure-hearted puppy. If you loved this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.